I am Maria, a 35-year-old woman from Seville, married to Antonio for a decade. Our love story began in the cobblestone streets of Seville, between the aroma of orange blossom and the sound of flamenco guitars. I remember our wedding day like it was yesterday. The sun was shining over the Giralda as we exchanged vows in the cathedral. Everything seemed perfect, but there was a shadow that loomed over our happiness from the beginning: my mother-in-law, Dolores. Dolores has always been an imposing woman, with a strong personality that fills any room she enters. From the first day I met her, I felt her scrutinizing gaze on me, as if she were evaluating whether I was worthy of her precious son. However, it wasn't until after the wedding that I realized the true nature of his favoritism. Ernesto, Antonio's younger brother, has always been Dolores's right eye. At first, I thought it was normal for a mother to have a special bond with her youngest child. But as time went by, the difference in treatment became increasingly evident and painful. I remember one Christmas Eve, just a year after our wedding. The whole family was gathered at Dolores' house. The festive atmosphere filled the air. I had spent hours preparing a traditional dessert, following my grandmother's recipe. When it came time to serve the sweets, Dolores didn't even try mine. "Oh, Maria," she said in a condescending tone, "Ernesto brought some wonderful sweets from that pastry shop downtown. Why don't we try them instead?" I felt like I'd been slapped, but I smiled and nodded, trying to keep the peace. Antonio, next to me, just shrugged his shoulders and continued eating. It was the first of many occasions where my husband chose silence over defense. As the years passed, the slights piled up. At every family gathering, Dolores found a way to highlight Ernesto's accomplishments while downplaying ours. If Antonio got a promotion at work, Dolores barely mentioned it. But if Ernesto changed cars, it was cause for celebration for weeks. "Have you seen Ernesto's new car, Maria?" Dolores asked me every time we saw each other. My Ernesto has always had good taste. I wish Antonio would learn from his brother. I tried to talk to Antonio about his mother's behavior on numerous occasions, but he always received the same response: "Come on, Maria, don't be exaggerated. My mother is like that, she doesn't do it with bad intentions. Besides, Ernesto is the little one, it's normal that she pampers him a little more." But it wasn't a little more. It was a chasm of difference that grew deeper with each passing year. Invitations to eat at Dolores's house became less frequent for us, while Ernesto and his wife Lucia were invited almost daily. Even on our wedding anniversary, Dolores found a way to make the day revolve around Ernesto. We had organized a small dinner in our garden, with the closest family. Just as we were about to toast, Dolores stood up and announced, "I have wonderful news. Ernesto just told me that they are going to make me a grandmother. Lucia is pregnant." All eyes turned to the young couple, who were smiling shyly. Our anniversary was completely overshadowed. While everyone congratulated Ernesto and Lucia, I sat there, with the glass in my hand, feeling the hope I had put into that special night fading. As the years passed, I learned to smile and nod, to swallow the pain and frustration. I told myself that the love that Antonio and I shared was stronger than any maternal favoritism. But deep down, a little voice whispered to me that I was fighting a losing battle. 10 years after our wedding, the situation has only gotten worse. Every visit from Dolores is a test of my patience. Every family gathering is an emotional minefield. I have tried to talk to Antonio countless times, but he continues to minimize the situation. "Maria, my love," he says to me with a tone that oscillates between condescension and exasperation, "don't you think it's time for you to get over this? My mother is older, she has her quirks. We can't change her." And so, day after day, year after year, I have been building a silent resentment, not only towards Dolores, but also towards Antonio for his inability to see the damage this is causing us. Sometimes, in the stillness of the night, I wonder how much longer I can endure this situation before something inside me breaks irreparably. But for now, I'm still here, in our house in Seville, trying to stay calm in the middle of the storm that is my relationship with my mother-in-law. Little do I know, the real test for our marriage is about to arrive at our door. It was a Thursday night like any other in Seville. The heat of the day was beginning to subside, giving way to a cool breeze that filtered through the open windows of our house. Antonio and I were in the living room, enjoying a quiet dinner when the doorbell rang unexpectedly. "Who is it at this time?" I asked, surprised. Antonio shrugged and got up to open the door. What I saw next left me speechless. There, on the threshold of our house, were Ernesto and Lucia, with several suitcases at their feet. Their faces showed a mixture of discomfort and expectation that immediately put me on alert. "Little brother," Ernesto exclaimed, hugging Antonio with an effusiveness that seemed exaggerated to me. "I hope you don't mind that we came unannounced." Before he could react, Lucia was already entering the house, dragging one of the suitcases. "Maria, dear, how are you?" He greeted me with a kiss on each cheek, as if it were the most normal thing in the world to show up at someone's house without prior notice and with luggage. "We're fine," I responded, still stunned by the situation. "But what's going on? Why did they come with suitcases?" Ernesto and Lucia exchanged a look that I couldn't interpret. It was Antonio who responded, with a smile that seemed forced to me. "Come on, Maria, don't be like that. They are family. I'm sure they have a good reason for being here." Just when he was going to insist on an explanation, the doorbell rang again. This time, it was Ernesto who rushed to open the door, revealing Dolores, my mother-in-law, with a triumphant smile on her face. "It's good that they are here," Dolores exclaimed, entering as if she were the owner of the house. "Antonio, my son, isn't it wonderful? Ernesto and Lucia will stay with you for a while." I felt the ground move under my feet. "Stay with us? For a while? What exactly did that mean?" "Excuse me," I interrupted, trying to stay calm, "but I think I deserve an explanation. What's going on here?" Dolores looked at me with that expression of superiority that I hated so much. "Oh, Maria, always so dramatic. It's very simple. Ernesto and Lucia are going through a difficult time and need a place to stay. What better than their brother's house?" I looked at Antonio, waiting for him to say something, to support me, to at least show some sign of surprise. But he just nodded, as if this was all perfectly normal. "Sure, Mom," he said in a voice I didn't recognize. "Ernesto and Lucia can stay as long as they need." I felt like I was short of breath. How could Antonio make a decision like that without consulting me? This was our home, our space. And suddenly, without warning, it was becoming a shelter for his brother and sister-in-law. "Antonio," I said, trying to control the tremor in my voice, "can we talk in private for a moment?" But before Antonio could respond, Dolores intervened again. "There is nothing to talk about, Maria. It has already been decided. Ernesto and Lucia are staying. End of discussion." I watched as Ernesto and Lucia began to unpack, moving through our house as if it belonged to them. Dolores directed them, telling them where they could put their things, which room they could use. And Antonio simply watched them with a complacent smile, as if all this were the most normal thing in the world. I retreated to the kitchen, needing a moment to process what was happening. I felt like I had entered a parallel dimension where my opinions and feelings didn't matter at all. While I was washing the dishes from the interrupted dinner, I listened to the laughter and conversations coming from the living room. Dolores was telling anecdotes from Ernesto and Antonio's childhood, as always, extolling the virtues of her youngest son. "Do you remember, Antonio, when Ernesto won that math contest at school? I always knew he would go far. It's a shame that things aren't going well for him now, but I'm sure he'll recover soon. He has the potential for great things. I closed my eyes, trying to contain the frustration building inside me. How had we gotten to this point? At what point had I lost control over my own home? When I finished in the kitchen, I returned to the living room. The scene I found looked like something out of a family Christmas gathering, not a surprise invasion on a Thursday night. Ernesto and Lucia were comfortably seated on our couch, Dolores was in my favorite chair, and Antonio seemed perfectly happy with the whole situation. "Maria, dear," Dolores called me with false sweetness, "why don't you bring us something to drink? We have to celebrate that the family is reunited." I felt something inside me break a little more. This wasn't a family reunion, it was an invasion. And worst of all, my own husband seemed to agree with it. While serving the drinks, I couldn't help but notice the knowing looks between Dolores, Ernesto, and Lucia. There was something in the air, an underlying tension that I couldn't fully identify. What were they hiding? Why were they really here? As the night progressed, the feeling of discomfort and bewilderment only grew inside me. This wasn't just an unexpected visit, there was something else, something they weren't telling me. And I had a feeling that whatever it was, I wasn't going to like it at all. The days following the unexpected arrival of Ernesto and Lucia were a whirlwind of subtle but significant changes in our house. Every morning, I would wake up hoping it had all been a bad dream, only to be met with the stark reality that our lives had been invaded. The first indication that something was wrong beyond just the extended visit came on a Tuesday morning. I got up early, as usual, to prepare breakfast before going to work. As I entered the kitchen, I froze in the doorway. Dolores and Lucia were there, moving pots and pans, rearranging the cupboards. "Good morning, Maria," Dolores said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I hope you don't mind, but we've decided to reorganize the kitchen a little. Lucia has a wonderful system for organizing everything, and we thought it would be good to implement it here." I felt like I had been punched in the stomach. "But, this is my kitchen," I muttered, more to myself than to them. Lucia looked at me with feigned sympathy. "Oh, Maria, don't worry. You'll find that everything is much more efficient this way. Plus, since we're going to be here for a while, we thought it would be nice to feel at home." Feel at home? Wasn't this my house? I wanted to scream, but the words stuck in my throat. Instead, I just nodded mechanically and left the kitchen, without breakfast, feeling like a stranger in my own home. As the days passed, the situation worsened. One Thursday afternoon, when I returned from work, I found Dolores and Lucia in our bedroom, taking clothes out of the closets and putting them in boxes. "What are they doing?" I asked, unable to hide my indignation. Dolores looked at me as if I was the one out of place. "We're making space, Maria. Ernesto and Lucia need to store their things somewhere. We thought they could use this closet, and you can take some things up to the attic. In short, there are many things that you don't use." I felt anger rising in my throat. "But they are our things, our space. They can't just—" "Maria," Lucia interrupted me with a honeyed voice, "don't be selfish. We are family, right? We have to help each other in difficult times." I looked for Antonio, hoping that he would support me, that he would put an end to this madness. I found him in the hallway, watching the scene with an unreadable expression. "Antonio," I pleaded, "say something. They can't do this." He just shrugged. "Come on, Maria, it's no big deal. They're just rearranging a little. Don't be like that." That night, as I lay in bed unable to sleep, I heard Antonio whispering to someone in the hallway. I got up quietly and approached the door. "I know it's difficult, Mom," Antonio said, "but give it time. Maria will adapt." "I hope so," Dolores' voice responded. "Remember what we talked about. It's best for everyone." The best for everyone? What were they talking about? A chill ran down my spine. There was something else here, a plan that I wasn't a part of. The following days were a succession of small humiliations and loss of control. I found my favorite books packed in boxes in the attic, my terrace plants had been replaced by Lucia's, even the sofa where I used to read had been moved to make room for Ernesto's desk. Every time I tried to talk to Antonio about the situation, he was evasive. "Don't exaggerate, Maria," he told me over and over again. "They're just trying to make themselves comfortable. They'll leave when things get better for them." But when would that be? And why did they have to feel comfortable at the expense of our comfort, our space? One afternoon, while looking for some important documents on my desk, I noticed that some papers had been moved. I panicked when I couldn't find my passport and some bank documents. I frantically searched for them throughout the house, until I finally found them in a box in the attic, along with other personal belongings that had been relocated without my consent. It was at that moment that reality hit me with full force. This was not a long visit. This was a deliberate attempt to remove us from our own home. They were trying to erase us, to gradually eliminate us from our own home. With my heart beating furiously, I went down the stairs determined to confront Antonio. I found him in the living room, laughing with Ernesto while they watched a soccer game. The domestic scene, so normal in appearance, suddenly seemed sinister to me. "Antonio," I said with a shaky voice, "we need to talk. Now." He looked at me with irritation. "Can't it wait? We're in the middle of the game." "No," I responded, feeling weeks' worth of pent-up fury bursting inside me. "It can't wait. I want to know what's really going on here. Why are they moving our stuff? Why are you acting like this is all normal?" Antonio stood up slowly, his face a mask of guilt and resignation. "Mary, I..." But before he could finish, Dolores entered the room, her presence filling the space as it always did. "What's going on here? Maria, why are you upset?" And that's when I knew, with blood-curdling certainty, that I was about to discover a truth that would change everything forever. The tension in the room was palpable. Dolores looked at me with a mixture of disdain and defiance, while Antonio seemed to be internally struggling with something he couldn't express. Ernesto, for his part, had turned off the television and was observing the scene with an expression of poorly concealed guilt. "Antonio," I insisted, ignoring Dolores' intimidating presence, "I need you to tell me the truth. What is really going on?" My husband avoided my gaze, fixing his eyes on the floor. A few seconds that seemed like forever passed before he finally spoke. "Maria," he began with a trembling voice, we have been talking." "For God's sake, Antonio." Dolores interrupted impatiently. "Tell him already. There's no reason to beat around the bush." Antonio took a deep breath before continuing. "Maria, my mother has suggested that perhaps it would be better if we gave our house to Ernesto and Lucia." I felt like the ground was opening up under my feet. "What?" I managed to say, unable to process what I had just heard. "Think about it, Maria," Dolores intervened with a tone that was intended to be reasonable. "Ernesto and Lucia are going through a difficult time. They just lost their apartment, and with the baby on the way, they need a stable place. They need this house more than you do." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I looked at Antonio, hoping to see some sign in his eyes that this was all a cruel joke, but what I saw chilled me: resignation and, worse, agreement. "Antonio," I gasped, do you agree with this?" He nodded slowly. "Maria, I know it sounds crazy, but think about it. We can start over somewhere else. Ernesto and Lucia really need help now." Anger and disbelief mixed inside me, creating a whirlwind of emotions that threatened to make me explode. "Start over?" I shouted. "This is our house. We've lived here for 10 years. How can you even consider giving it away?" "It's not giving it away," Ernesto intervened, speaking for the first time. "It would be more of a long-term loan. Until we recover financially." I looked at him in disbelief. "A loan? And where are we supposed to live in the meantime?" "You could have my old apartment," Dolores suggested in a tone that suggested she was doing us a big favor. "It's smaller, but for you two it's more than enough." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. It was as if he had entered an alternate dimension where everyone had lost their minds. "This is crazy," I said, trying to stay calm. "Antonio, you can't be serious. This is our house, our home. We have built a life here." "I know, Maria," Antonio responded in a soft voice, as if he were talking to a girl. "But sometimes you have to make sacrifices for your family. Ernesto is my brother, and he needs our help." "And what about me?" I exclaimed, feeling tears beginning to form in my eyes. "Aren't I your family? Don't my feelings, my desires, count?" "Of course they count," Antonio said, but his tone lacked conviction. "But you have to understand that." "Understand what?" I interrupted him. "That my opinion doesn't matter. That you can make decisions that completely affect our lives without even consulting me." Dolores let out an exasperated sigh. "Maria, you are being melodramatic. This is the best for everyone. Ernesto and Lucia need stability, especially with the baby on the way. And you two are young, you can adapt." I looked at her, unable to contain my indignation. "Melodramatic? We're talking about our house, our home. They can't just decide to give it away without." "It's already decided," Dolores interrupted me firmly. "Antonio agrees, and as head of the family, his word is what counts." I looked at Antonio, searching his eyes for some sign of doubt, some sign that he would realize the absurdity of the situation. But all I saw was determination and a hint of guilt. "I'm sorry, Maria," he said quietly. "But I think it's the right thing to do." At that moment, I felt like something inside me broke. The man who had sworn to love and protect me was choosing to please his mother and brother over our marriage, over our future. "I can't believe this," I muttered, more to myself than anyone else. "I can't believe you're willing to throw away 10 years of marriage for this." "I'm not throwing anything overboard," Antonio protested weakly. "I'm just trying to help my family." "And what am I?" I shouted, unable to contain my frustration any longer. "Aren't I your family? Don't the vows we made mean nothing to you?" The silence that followed my words was deafening. Dolores looked at me with a mixture of triumph and disdain, Ernesto looked uncomfortable, and Antonio just looked lost. In that moment, looking into the eyes of the man I had shared my life with for a decade, I realized that nothing would ever be the same. The trust, the mutual respect, everything had collapsed in a matter of minutes. With tears streaming down my cheeks, I turned around and left the room, leaving behind the remains of what I once believed was a strong, loving marriage. The days following the confrontation were a nightmare. I moved around the house like a ghost, avoiding at all costs to meet Dolores, Ernesto, or Lucia. Antonio tried to talk to me, but I couldn't bear to look into his eyes without feeling a mixture of pain and rage that suffocated me. One morning, while everyone was out, I decided to look for the important documents that had been relocated to the attic. I needed to make sure everything was in order, just in case. I didn't even dare finish that thought. I climbed the attic stairs with a heavy heart, remembering how we used to store Christmas decorations and boxes of memories from our early years together there. Now, those boxes were stacked in a corner, covered in dust, like they were old junk someone wanted to get rid of. As I was rummaging through the boxes, I heard the front door open and close. I assumed it would be Antonio returning from work, so I didn't give it any importance. I continued with my task, until I found the box with the documents I was looking for. I was about to open it when I heard footsteps on the attic stairs. I turned, expecting to see Antonio, but to my surprise, it was Dolores who was walking up the last steps. "What are you doing up here, Maria?" he asked in a tone that was intended to be casual, but that failed to hide his suspicion. "I'm looking for some important documents," I replied dryly, still holding the box in my hands. Dolores approached, her eyes fixed on the box. "What kind of documents?" "Personal," I replied, feeling irritation rising inside me. "It's my stuff, Dolores. I don't think it's any of your business." I saw a flash of something in his eyes, anger, worry. I couldn't identify it with certainty. He moved closer, trying to see the contents of the box. "As Antonio's mother, I believe I have the right to know what is happening in this house," she said with an authoritative tone that made my blood boil. "This is MY house, Dolores," I responded, raising my voice without realizing it. "And these are MY documents. You have no right to." I couldn't finish the sentence. In one swift movement, Dolores tried to snatch the box from my hands. We struggled for a moment, and in the process, the contents spilled across the attic floor. Among the scattered papers, I saw something that chilled me. It was a copy of the deed to the house. I picked it up quickly, before Dolores could reach it. "What is that?" he asked, his voice tinged with poorly concealed anxiety. I stared at her, feeling the realization hit me like a wave. "You were looking for this, right? That's why you've been moving our stuff, snooping through our documents." Dolores stood up straight, abandoning all pretense of innocence. "That doesn't matter. What matters is that this house should be for Ernesto and Lucia. They need it more than you. And that's why you think you have the right to rummage through my personal things?" I shouted, unable to contain my indignation. "I do what is best for my family," Dolores responded, also raising her voice. "Antonio agrees with me. This house is too big for the two of you. Ernesto and Lucia need it more, especially with the baby on the way." It was at that moment when all the pieces fell into place. The plan, the gradual invasion of our house, the whispered conversations. It had all been orchestrated by Dolores from the beginning. "You planned all this," I said, feeling a mixture of horror and amazement. The sudden arrival of Ernesto and Lucia, the reorganization of the house. You were trying to pressure us to leave. Dolores did not deny anything. Instead, he looked at me with an expression of defiance. I do what a mother should do. I protect my children and make sure they have the best. What about me? I asked, feeling angry tears forming in my eyes. Am I not part of this family? Don't I deserve consideration? You are expendable, Dolores responded with a coldness that left me breathless. Antonio can find someone else, someone who understands the importance of family. His words hit me like a slap. Before he could respond, we heard footsteps on the stairs. Antonio appeared in the attic, looking at us with a confused expression. What's going on here? He asked, shifting his gaze from his mother to me. Your mother just admitted that this whole thing was a plan to kick us out of our own house, I said, struggling to maintain my composure. Antonio looked surprised for a moment, but then his expression hardened. Maria, we already talked about this. It's the best for everyone. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The man I had married, the man who had sworn to love and protect me, was choosing his mother's manipulative scheme over our marriage. The best for everyone? I repeated incredulously. Is it best to kick your wife out of her own home? Is it best to allow your mother to rummage through our personal documents? Maria, you're exaggerating, Antonio said, but I could see the guilt in his eyes. She knew what they were doing was wrong, but she didn't have the strength to face her mother. No, Antonio, I responded, feeling a sudden calm. I'm not exaggerating. I finally see things clearly. I see who you really are and how little I mean to you. Dolores took advantage of my moment of vulnerability to try to take the writing from my hands, but I held on tight. Enough, I shouted. This is MY house. Mine and Antonio's. They have no right to kick us out, they have no right to decide about our lives. The decision has already been made, Dolores said firmly. Antonio agrees. As his wife, you should support him. I looked at Antonio, searching his eyes for some sign that he would realize the absurdity of the situation, how unfair he was being. But all I saw was resignation and guilt. At that moment, something inside me definitively broke. The love she had felt for Antonio all these years turned into a mixture of disappointment and resentment. It's over, I said quietly, but with determination. I'm not going to continue being part of this madness. I'm not going to allow myself to be kicked out of my own home, treated as if I were expendable. Maria, please, Antonio began, but I interrupted him. No, Antonio. You have already made your decision. You have chosen your mother and your brother over me, over our marriage. Well, I have made a decision too. With those words, I turned around and walked down the attic stairs, leaving behind a stunned Antonio and a triumphant Dolores. As I walked down, I felt like I was closing a chapter of my life, a chapter full of love, but also disappointments and manipulations. What none of them knew, what was about to change everything, was the ace up my sleeve that I had in store. An ace that he was about to reveal and that would put an end to his plans once and for all. With my heart pounding in my chest, I went down the attic stairs, aware that Antonio and Dolores were following me closely. I could feel their gazes boring into my back, a mix of confusion and concern emanating from them. I arrived at the living room, where Ernesto and Lucia were sitting, oblivious to the drama that had unfolded upstairs. All of you, sit down, I said in a voice I didn't recognize as my own. It was firm, authoritative, without a trace of the tremor he had felt moments before. Ernesto and Lucia exchanged confused looks, but they obeyed. Antonio sat next to them, while Dolores remained standing, her eyes narrowed in suspicion. Maria, whatever you're thinking. Antonio began, but I interrupted him with a sharp wave of my hand. No, Antonio. You've had your chance to speak. Now it's my turn. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the document I held in my hands. It was the moment of truth. 4 years, I began, my voice gaining strength with each word. I have endured favoritism, manipulations, and rudeness. I have tried to be the perfect wife, the understanding daughter-in-law. I have sacrificed my own wants and needs for the sake of this family. But not anymore. I watched as Antonio shifted uncomfortably in his seat, while Dolores looked at me with a mixture of disdain and curiosity. They thought they could kick me out of my own house, I continued. That they could erase me from their lives as if I were an old piece of furniture they wanted to get rid of. But they made a mistake. A very big mistake. With trembling hands, I unfolded the document I had been saving. The deed of the house. I saw how everyone's eyes focused on the paper. This house, I said, my voice trembling slightly, is not Antonio's. It is not Ernesto's. And it is certainly not yours, Dolores. I paused, savoring the moment before dropping the bombshell. This house is in my name. The silence that followed my statement was deafening. I saw how the color left Dolores's face, how Antonio opened and closed his mouth without emitting any sound, how Ernesto and Lucia looked with panic. What do you mean? Antonio finally managed to articulate. Exactly what I said, I replied, my voice gaining confidence. The writing is in my name. It was a gift from my parents when we got married. They wanted to make sure I always had a place to call home. Dolores took a step forward, his face contorted by anger. That is impossible. Antonio, tell him that it is impossible. But Antonio was pale, and I could see in his eyes that he remembered the moment when my parents gave us the news. A moment that apparently had conveniently forgotten. It's true, Antonio murmured, his voice barely audible. I had forgotten, but Maria is right. The house is in her name. Dolores's face went from shock to fury in seconds. This is a hoax. A trap. You can't do this, Maria. You can't take us. I stood, feeling a force that I didn't know I possessed. No, Dolores. I'm not like you. I'm not going to throw anyone. But I'm not going to allow me either. I turned to Ernesto and Lucia, who seemed to want to disappear on the couch. You two can stay the time you need to find a new place. But it will be under my conditions. Then, I looked at Antonio, feeling how the love I once felt mixed with a deep disappointment. As for you, Antonio, we have a lot to talk about. But not now. Now, I need everyone to leave this room. I need to be alone. I saw how the realization of what had just happened was reflected in his faces. Dolores was the first to react, heading towards the door with furious steps. Ernesto and Lucia followed her in silence, avoiding looking me in the eye. Antonio lagged, his pleading eyes looking for mine. Maria, me. Not now, Antonio, I interrupted him, feeling how fatigue invaded me. Please, just go. With a last remorse look, Antonio left the room, closing the door behind him. I collapsed on the couch, the tears I had finally containing flowing freely. The adrenaline of the moment began to dissipate, leaving me exhausted but strangely in peace. I looked around, at the house that had witnessed so many happy moments and now felt like a battlefield. I knew that things would never be the same again, but for the first time in a long time, I felt that I had control of my life. The minutes passed, maybe hours, while processing everything that had happened. The silence in the house was deafening, broken only by the occasional murmur of voices from the kitchen. Finally, I gathered strength to get up. I knew that what was coming would not be easy. I would have to face Antonio, establish clear limits with pain, and decide what to do with my marriage. But for the first time in a long time, I was not afraid. I headed towards the door, ready to face what I came. Before opening it, I looked at the writing one last time. It was more than a legal document, it was a symbol of my independence, of my strength. With a deep sigh, I opened the door. It was time to start the next chapter of my life, one in which I would be the author of my own story. When I opened the living room door, I found a tense silence that seemed to wrap the entire house. I could feel everyone's looks about me, a mixture of shock, disbelief and, in the case of Dolores, a barely contained anger. Antonio was sitting at the kitchen table, with his head in his hands, while Ernesto and Lucia stood in a corner, as if they wanted to melt with the walls. I breathed deeply, feeling the weight of writing in my hands as a protective shield. It was time to put the cards on the table, once and for all. Well, I said, my surprisingly firm voice. I think we all have a lot to talk about. Dolores was the first to react, taking a step forward with your eyes calling. There is nothing to talk about. This is a hoax, A trap that you have been planning from the beginning. I felt how anger bubbled inside me, but forced myself to keep calm. No, Dolores. The only deception here is the one you have been plotting. You have tried to throw me out of my own home, erase from Antonio's life as if it were a mistake to correct. Antonio raised his head, his red-up eyes looking for mine. Maria, I'm sorry. I don't know how I could forget writing. I don't know how I could allow things to get so far. I do know how, I replied, feeling how repressed frustration came to the surface. You have always been weak in front of your mother, Antonio. You've always put your wishes above ours, mine. Dolores released a bitter laugh. Weak? My son is not weak. He simply understands the importance of the family, something that you clearly do not understand. I turned to her, feeling how my patience was running out. Family? He calls family to try to throw his daughter-in-law from his own home? To manipulate his son to betray his wife? No, Dolores. That is not a family. That is pure toxicity. I saw how Ernesto took a step forward, his face a guilt mask. Maria, we didn't want things to get to this point. Mom convinced us that it was the best for everyone. Lucia, next to her, nodded. We feel very much, Maria. We get carried away by despair and, well, for the promises of pain. I felt a pouring stab for them. They were both victims and complicit in this tangle. I understand that they are going through a difficult time, I said, softening my tone a little. But that does not justify what they have done. It does not justify that they have tried to take our home. Antonio got up slowly, approaching me cautiously. Maria, please. I know that I have made a terrible mistake. I know that I have failed you in all possible ways. But I love you. We can fix this, we can. I interrupted him, feeling how tears threatened to sprout again. Loving me? Antonio, if you really loved me, you would never have considered taking me out of our house. You would never have put your mother's wishes over our marriage. I saw how pain was reflected in his eyes, but I couldn't afford to be soft. It was time to be strong, to defend what was mine. This is what is going to happen, I said, looking at each of them. This house is mine, legally and morally. No one is going to take me out of here. Ernesto, Lucia, can stay for now, until they find a new place. But it will be under my conditions. Dolores took a step forward, his red face. You can't do this. You can't simply. Yes, I can, Dolores, I interrupted it, my firm and determined voice. And I am doing it. From now on, you are no longer welcome in this house. You have shown that you do not respect me or my marriage to your son. So I ask him to leave. The silence that followed my words was deafening. I saw how disbelief was mixed with the fury on the face of Dolores, how Antonio paled to the idea of facing his mother. Antonio, said Dolores, his voice trembling with rage. Are you going to allow me to speak like this? Are you going to let me take from my own son's house? All eyes turned to Antonio. I saw how he fought internally, his eyes moving from his mother to me and back. Finally, after what seemed an eternity, he spoke. Mom, he said, his voice just a whisper. Maria is right. You've been too far this time. Please, go. The expression of Dolores went from disbelief to shock and finally to a cold and calculator fury. Well, he said, straightened. If so, they want things to be, so it is. But remember my words, they will regret this. With that, he took his bag and headed towards the door. Before leaving, he turned one last time. Antonio, when you realize the mistake you are making, I will be waiting. A mother always forgives. And with that, he left, the sound of the door closing resonating in the house like thunder. The silence that followed was heavy, loaded with unpasted emotions and painful truths. Ernesto and Lucia seemed not to know what to do with themselves, moving uncomfortably in his corner. You too, I said, addressing them. They can stay in the guest room for now. But I want them to start looking for a new place immediately. And I expect a sincere apology, not just empty words. Both nodded, murmuring thanks and apologies before retiring quickly, leaving me alone with Antonio. I looked at him, I really looked at him, for the first time in what seemed years. I saw the lines of concern on your forehead, dark circles under your eyes, the weight of guilt on your shoulders. Part of me wanted to comfort him, tell him that everything would be fine. But the strongest part, the part that had been betrayed and belittled, knew that things would never be the same again. Antonio, I said gently, I think we need to talk about our future. He nodded, his eyes full of non-shed tears. I know. Maria, I'm so sorry. I don't know how I could let things get to this point. I have failed you in every possible way. I felt how my heart was pressed in my chest. In spite of everything, despite pain and betrayal, a part of me still loved it. But I knew love was not enough. Not after this. Yes, you have failed me, I said, my voice breaking slightly. You have put your mother and your brother above me, above our marriage. You have been willing to throw me out of our house, Antonio. I don't know if I can forgive that. I saw how pain was reflected in his eyes, but I couldn't retract. Not now. I understand, he said finally. What do you want us to do? I breathed deeply, knowing that the words that we're about to say would change our lives forever. I think we need to separate, Antonio. I need time to think, to heal. And I think you need time to decide what is really important for you. Antonio nodded slowly, tears finally falling down his cheeks. I understand. And you are right. I have been a coward, a bad husband. You deserve much more than this. He rose slowly, as if each movement cost him an immense effort. I'll leave tonight. I will look for a place to stay. Can I call you? To see how you are. I nodded, feeling how my own tears began to fall. Yes, you can call. But I need time, Antonio. I can't promise anything. I saw him nod for one last time before heading to our room, presumably to pack some things. I stayed there, in the middle of the room, feeling how the world I knew fell apart around me. Hours later, when the house was finally silent, I found myself alone in my bed. The tears that had finally been containing freely flowed. I cried for the love I had lost, because of the confidence that had been betrayed, by the dreams that had become shattered. But in the midst of pain, I also felt a strange feeling of liberation. For the first time in years, I was taking control of my life. She was no longer the complacent daughter-in-law, the wife who crouched her head at the demands of others. It was Maria, strong and determined, owner of her destiny. While looking out the window, seeing how the sun began to look at the horizon, I knew that this was not the end. It was a new beginning. A difficult beginning, painful, but mine. And for the first time in a long time, I felt hope.